Welcome to a new unit and a new time period in AP Euro, namely 1648 to 1815. Now, many of the continental European states during this period were moving toward a new iteration of monarchy, which is to say absolutism, in which the monarch held, absolute power. But not so in England, my friends. In England, although there was a press toward absolutism, ultimately a constitutional government won out, and it would take the English Civil War to settle that dispute. And hey, if you want follow-along notes for this and all my AP Euro videos, then the link is in the description. So if you're ready to get that brain cow's milk shared power style, then let's get to it. So as I mentioned, France, Prussia, Austria, and Russia were all moving towards absolutism, but England was a firmly constitutional government. That means that the power of their government was limited by rule of law. So with that limitation firmly established, no English monarch could rule absolutely because that monarch was required to share power with the English Parliament, which was the legislative body that represented the interests of the English people. Now, that sounds like a pretty good thing, right? Well, it was, but there were 3 points of tension that were brewing. First was the doctrine of the divine right of kings. The idea here was that just as God had granted spiritual authority to the church, he simultaneously granted political authority to the king. And think about that for a second. Remember all that you've learned in the previous period about the authority of the church. That authority, at least by the church's own reckoning, was absolute, and if anyone challenged it, it did not go well for them. And the reason is that if God granted authority to the church, then to challenge the church was to challenge God himself. So by the same reasoning, if God granted political authority to the king, then to challenge that authority would be a direct affront to God. And since God is never wrong, then by implication, the king could never be wrong either. And if a king decides that he has God's own wisdom and authority, then that could get, interesting. And that means that I need to introduce you to Charles I, who succeeded James I on the throne of England. Charles was a big believer in the divine right of kings, which he interpreted to mean that the king does whatever he wants. For example, because the king was God's vice-regent, he believed that he could seize any land he wanted because, Jesus. But that turned out to be a problem for the Parliament, especially those in the lower house, the House of Commons, who were fond of reminding the king that by England's constitutional standards, land could only be seized through the due process of law. To which Charles responded, "But I want it, and, Jesus." And so, believing that he had God's go-ahead to do whatever he wanted, Charles continued doing such things and caused great consternation between him and the Parliament. Okay, now the second cause of the English Civil War was economic, specifically when it came to the debt accrued from England's participation in the 30 Years' War. It'll be enough for you to know that during this war, Charles I and his father James spent a ton of money that wasn't authorized by Parliament. And again, that caused tension between the crown and the people's representatives, and all throughout the war, Parliament was trying to rein in the king's extravagant spending. Now, in order to fix this problem, Charles decided to dissolve the Parliament by refusing to call them into session from 1629 to 1640. This period became known as Charles's personal rule because he did whatever he wanted without harassment from those pesky parliamentarians who were always going on about their rights. But as it turned out, by 1640, Charles's little divine right piggy bank was empty and he needed money to address a rebellion in Scotland, and so he called Parliament back into session. This was known as the Short Parliament because they weren't really cooperating with the king, so he went ahead and dismissed them again. Then he called for elections of yet another parliament, which became known as the Long Parliament, so called because when the diaper baby Charles I wasn't getting what he wanted out of them, he dismissed them, and they were like, "Oh, heck nah." And we'll return to that tension in just a moment. But the third cause of the English Civil War was religious. Now remember that Henry VIII had established the Protestant Church of England, or the Anglican Church, in defiance of the Catholic Church. But the truth is, Henry didn't do that because he was anti-Catholic, but rather because the Pope refused to grant him a divorce. And so it's not as if he was a reformer who wanted to get as far away from Catholicism as possible. The point is, the Anglican Church was still pretty Catholic in its form and liturgy. And that's when a group of English clergy who became known as the Puritans rose up and started agitating for the removal of all that Catholicness from the Anglican Church, which is to say they wanted to purify the Church of England. But like the Parliament, they also ran into Charles' problems. His dad, James I, wasn't interested in acting on Puritan demands, and then Charles did the unthinkable. Dude married a Catholic. So the point is this: Charles I wants to act like an absolute monarch, but Parliament is always trying to rein him in. If you put all these causes in a pot, well baby, you got a stew going, and that stew tastes like the English Civil War. Now on a broad scale, the English Civil War was a conflict between the king, Parliament, and other elites over their respective roles in the political structure. In other words, the war was fought to decide this question: will England be ruled by an absolute monarch or exist as a constitutional monarch? To settle this question, each side prepared for battle. Charles fled to North England, where he raised an army composed of the nobility and rural gentry, while Parliament created the new model army. So for 3 years, these two forces clashed, and finally the new model army was victorious. But as we already established earlier, Charles was a diaper baby and refused to admit defeat. And so the decisive move came when a Puritan parliamentarian named Oliver Cromwell took the leadership of the new model army and finally crushed the king's forces. And in doing so, Cromwell captured the king as well. Afterward, Cromwell removed all members of Parliament who opposed him, and the representatives left were known as the RUMP Parliament. And so with Parliament composed only of Cromwell supporters, supporters, they tried the king for treason, found him guilty, and cut his dang head off. And so as a result, England became a true republic called the Protectorate under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, who was named Lord Protector. And on paper, the Protectorate entrusted the legislative authority to the remaining members of Parliament, while executive authority was entrusted to a council. Let me further emphasize on paper, because the truth is that after the war, England was ruled by the army with Cromwell at its head. And that way, England was not the constitutional republic that everyone fought for, but rather a military dictatorship. And so Cromwell tried to work with Parliament to govern England, but they weren't doing what he wanted, so he dismissed them. I feel like I've heard this story before. And so for nearly a decade, Cromwell ruled England by force, the very thing he fought to abolish. And upon his death, the Protectorate fell apart and the English people were ready for a return to stability, which is to say, they wanted a king again. This became known as the Restoration period in 1660, and Parliament gave the throne to Charles II. Now this guy schemed with France and didn't work well with Parliament, and then came James II, who was worse because he kept appointing Catholics to important positions. Now Parliament by this point was fed up with the stupid monarchy, and after resisting James II over and over and over again, offered the throne to James's daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. Now when James heard this plan, he took it like a man and fled. So the throne, having been so unceremoniously abdicated, passed to William and Mary in 1689. This transfer of power was known as the Glorious Revolution because the monarchs were changed without bloodshed. But that's not quite true because there were quite a few rebellions and quite a bit of bloodshed. Regardless, with the ascension of William and Mary to the throne, the idea of the divine right of kings in England was essentially put to death. And then the last effect you need to know of this war was the composition of the English Bill of Rights. A condition of William and Mary accepting the throne was to abide by the English Bill of Rights, which limited the power of the monarchy and protected the power of Parliament. Within the Bill of Rights, several problems were rectified. For example, it said that only Parliament had the power to raise taxes, and it also said that when Parliament passed a law, it could not be annulled by the king. Okay, next you should go right here and keep reviewing the rest of Unit 3. And if you want follow-along notes for all the videos of Unit 3, click right here. Thanks for coming along. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.